Hey guys, it's Josh. I'm here with Mike Litgen, my fellow SC. Say hi, Mike.
Hey guys.
So today we're going to talk about ERSPAN and VMware. And Mike has so graciously allowed us a peek into his home lab where he's set this up and messed with it. So we're going to kind of walk through what ERSPAN is and how it functions. And then we'll walk through a basic setup of ERSPAN in a VMware environment. So Mike, let's start with what is ERSPAN?
So ERSPAN, and actually in VMware they call it encapsulated remote mirroring, but it's basically when you take a mirror off of a switch or a virtual switch in this case, and you encapsulate it in GRE tunnel and then send it across so it can actually be routed across the network rather than actually being like a traditional span, which has to actually leave that switch on a single port and go right into your whatever you're feeding that into. So it's just an ability to route a span across your network.
Yeah, and so that allows you to be able to capture spans from like virtual switching or east-west traffic that you might not be able to get through, like spanning the core, for instance, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah. So let's talk about, we hear VSwitch and DVSwitch. What are those differences, and maybe how does that affect ERSPAN?
Yeah, so VSwitch is what everybody's familiar with. They've used it basically every ESXi host deploys with just regular vSwitches. There's one per host. There's really no internal traffic that goes between the hosts on a regular vSwitch. Each vSwitch just sends traffic out to the physical switch to do its switching and routing. It's not a very full featured. It's just a real basic vSwitch. When we get into, and most customers are using DV switches now, as that stands for distributed virtual switching. Basically, all your hosts share a MAC table across them so they can more efficiently switch. But beyond that, there's a lot of stuff that you can do with them when it comes to adding hosts. You can automatically add VLANs to hosts just by pushing a configuration over. It's really a fantastic way to do virtual switching, but also it gives you a lot of extra features. And one of them we're talking about today is the encapsulated remote mirroring that we're going to use here today.
So ERSPAN is limited to DVSwitch. And most customers, like you said, DVSwitch is what most people think of as VMware switching for the most part, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, cool. Right. So then let's talk about why ERSPAN over other options. What would drive you to do ERSPAN?
Yeah, so this is something that we've worked through at ExtraHop and actually worked with VMware a little bit too. When you're looking at there are 4 different options, and depending on what version of ESX you're running, or vSphere, I should say, you're running, there's actually potentially 5 options for different spanning type protocols within the different DV switches. And really, you're gonna have it's kind of your mileage may vary based on whatever kind you're using. What we're kind of going for here is everything that's not the ERSPAN or encapsulated remote mirroring, as we'll look at. Basically, all of those actually have essentially the traffic being spanned out leaves that host directly. And maybe where I'm getting with that is that if you have traffic that goes between hosts, it's not going to get mirrored using those options, any options except for ERSPAN. The nice thing about ERSPAN is it still leaves each host directly, but it's being routed over the network to the sensor that we're actually sending it to. So where we missed a lot of traffic before with any of the other options, the encapsulated remote mirroring or ERSPAN is going to give us all the traffic within the environment.
So if I had a web and a database server on the same hypervisor and they were communicating to each other and it never left the DV switch, ERSPAN would put that into that GRE tunnel and send that over to ExtraHop.
Yeah, and actually even more so, if you had, let's say, to your point, a database server on one host and a web server on another host that just happen to be living on different hosts, depending on where you were actually doing a different type of span from, you're only going to get one set of traffic from that, where the ERSPAN is actually span traffic from both hosts or every host in your environment over to the sensor, so that we'll get all the traffic basically.
Cool. So what are some of the things? Obviously, this is not as straightforward as spanning the core. There's more caveats. You're essentially you could be doubling up some of your bandwidth. What are some of the other caveats that you've discovered deploying ERSPAN kind of in that design phase?
Yeah, so One of the things that we've really kind of run into, and one of the reasons why I think we're doing this video, Josh, is because there are some things where you can kind of get into some trouble. And this kind of covers a
Hmm.
couple of bullet points here. Basically, what you're doing is, as I kind of mentioned before, each host on its VM kernel 0 port. I'm thinking that's the only one it uses, but for best practices, we're not going to use any VM kernel ports in our ERSPAN. Just not good practice at all. But basically what happens is the host on that VM kernel port spins up a GRE tunnel to your sensor, and each host does that. And so where you kind of get to with that is you also have to look at everything in the path of that. So what I mean by that is my firewall in this environment is actually a virtual firewall. And so when traffic goes from one subnet to another through that virtual firewall, I have to be careful not to send that GRE tunnel through that interface of the firewall as well, because now that'll double up that traffic again, and we'll actually get kind of a
Hmm.
runaway situation there too. So you kind of have to think
Hmm.
about the whole flow of that GRE tunnel once it leaves those hosts and where it's going to get to your sensor as well.
Hmm.
Um,
So if
so
your
yeah,
ExtraHop is on
there's
the
a
other
couple
side
things
of a
about.
firewall, or you got to think about every step between the host of where it generates the ERSPAN and where the ExtraHop sits is where it's going to ingest that data and how it affects from a bandwidth perspective. And then is there any potential blockers between there, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Blockers, and are you going to get duplicated traffic, or basically kind of a runaway situation where you're mirroring mirrored packets, right? So
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And if that goes to like the core span, you have a physical span that can mirror the ER span, and you don't want to do that. So you got to be extra careful with that. And then final question on the caveats. You may not know exactly this, but there's got to be limitations on ER span as far as throughput and those type of things. Have you experienced any of that, or got any of that from VMware?
I'm sure that there are limits on it, and I'm not
Yeah.
sure of them off the top of my head. I know that once you get up to that 10 gigabit per second on those
Yeah, that's
hosts,
what I was thinking
I
too.
think you kind of get to a point where maybe you're pushing it a little too hard. But I guess
Yep.
I'm not positive on that. So
Yeah, no, I think I don't even know if VMware's positive on it, but I would agree that if you're starting to approach 10 gigs of ER span traffic, you're going to want to look at alternative ways of getting that data, virtual taps, spanning other areas. I think you start 10 gigs is, unless you're a super overhead environment, you're going to start to run into some issues. That's a lot of data to push and double up in most environments today.
oh, absolutely.
Cool.
And to your point, we do have some really awesome partners that we work with for virtual taps and things like that as well that work
Yeah,
extremely well.
totally.
So
All right, let's walk through a basic setup, Mike, when you're ready.
yeah. So just kind of before we get right into that, we do actually, if you get stuck as we're kind of going through this, or when you're doing it, we do have docs out on the website as well.
Yeah,
On
and
our
I'll
doc
include this
site
link
for
in the
configuring
video
this.
notes for sure.
Yeah.
And
So
this is
just
right here. You configure the ExtraHop interface settings. So if you need to configure the target on your ExtraHop box, what Mike's showing right here will allow you to ingest that ERSPAN target, which he's about to turn on VMware.
yeah. So let's just walk through it quickly here. It actually goes pretty quick, but we just got to make sure we steer clear of those caveats that we talked about.
Cool.
So this is my environment here. And so we'll just kind of, once you get into your vSphere client, you're going to want to navigate over to the network side of the menu here. And you can see I've got actually two DV switches in my environment here. One is my prod, and the other one is just strictly for vSAN and vMotion.
And you're doing this on a single hypervisor host. Did you do this per host, or can you set up multiple hosts? How's that particular work when you kind of?
So I actually have three hosts I have three hosts in this cluster.
Yeah.
You can see that I've actually got the three hosts here, and basically,
Okay.
so when you configure a DV switch, what you actually do is you configure all and we're getting kind of into the DV switch stuff, but we basically configure all of, like,
Yeah.
how many uplinks do you want, how many VLANs, that kind of stuff. And once you got that all
Got
configured,
it.
then you add hosts to it. So rather than
Okay.
like adding a vSwitch to a host and having to configure all the stuff, you've
Yeah.
created the vSwitch,
Got it.
and now you're just adding hosts to it and making a host basically enforce the profile.
And
that
you
give
slurp up with ERSPAN the entire DV switch. That's what we'll walk through here potentially.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yep. And
Cool.
that's the benefit of this, is we're doing it across the entire
Got it. Okay,
entire
that
DV
makes sense.
switch.
That's great.
Yeah. So we're gonna just kind of jump in here, and so we've got we're on our prod DV switch here, and we're gonna jump into port mirroring. Here you can see that that's one of the settings that we have amongst some of the other stuff here. We're just gonna configure a new one, and this is where we get those. I've got four here. Some people will have 5 options here. There's a deprecated option that you might see here as well, but we're really gonna want to do the encapsulated remote mirroring source. And we can leave, you can name it however you want. I suggest using a descriptive name of some kind to make sure that you know what it is. And we're going to set the status to enabled. Now, for ExtraHop, you can leave this as GRE. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. You actually have to go into ExtraHop and turn on NVGRE encapsulation. If you do this, you're better off using ERSPAN Type 2. I don't believe that we support Type 3 yet because I couldn't get that to work. So we're just going to do ERSPAN Type 2 here.
So Type 2 or GRE, but Type 2 is the recommended one.
Yeah, just because it's one less step on the ExtraHop side, you don't have to go and turn on NVGRE encapsulation. So this is going to be your easiest one.
Okay.
And then we're going to go and do our source ports here. And so this is every port, or this is going to show you every port on that's configured for all the VMs for within your environment. Now, I mean, officially the recommendation here is to go through and slowly add machines as you want to monitor them. So like, don't just go and blanket add all your machines to it, because maybe you don't know how much traffic you're sending, that kind of thing. You do have the option, as I'm doing
turn
here,
a couple on and then watch it in ExtraHop or something like that, Mike. Is what you're usually what you would do, like turn a couple on, watch it flow.
Yep, and just kind of see how much traffic you're sending to it, kind of get a good idea of how much bandwidth you're sending it to it. You can do it like this, just select all, but there's two things you absolutely have to be sure of here. Number one, that you're unselecting all of your VM kernel ports. So because you can have that duplicated mirror traffic, that can really lead to some bad times. So I'm going through and unselecting all those. The other thing you absolutely have to unselect as well is any port connecting to your ExtraHop sensor. The reason that is we're sending a whole pile of traffic to that, and if we're mirroring that traffic, we're doing the exact same thing, right? So we're doubling up that mirror. So
it really sounds like we need to just eliminate anything that will double up. It seems like it'd be easy if you're not paying attention to double up the mirror. You just got to walk through and make sure you're not doubling the mirror, because that could cause problems where it goes from 1 to 3 to 6 to 9 gigs very quickly. And it's really a 1 gig is what you want, right?
Absolutely. And, and I really like to make sure people take heed of this, because essentially if you do get into this point, your vSphere is going to be unavailable. Like the networking is essentially blown on the vSphere. The only way that I've found to get out of that, aside from actually going and manually via the command line creating new VSwitches to use for your networking, is you can reboot the hosts individually into maintenance mode so no VMs are running on them, and then basically deconfigure that, which is obviously not ideal. So you can really get into a bad situation if you don't.
Yeah, and that's unfun.
Actually do that. Yep. So I'm just going to go through.
That's a good call out for sure.
Yeah. Just go through one more time, make sure I don't have.
So not the ExtraHop EDA and not the VM kernel ports. That's the critical part here when we're setting up the ports.
Yep. Okay. That's the critical part. And again, I'll say it one more time. Like in my environment, I have a virtual firewall. I found that the port going to my virtual firewall was causing me to have outages when I would do it too, and that's just because that traffic was flowing through there to get to my sensor as well.
And that goes back to what you're saying. Know your traffic from the source all the way to the RevealX sensor, so that you understand if there are things blocking or causing duplicates along that path.
Yep, exactly right. So yeah, know that basically that path from each one of your hosts to the sensor. Know that path, and actually, I know it's not really feasible in a lot of environments, but if you can actually have the sensor and your hosts on the same subnet, I mean, you're going to eliminate all the routing in the middle, and you're going to eliminate most of those issues altogether. So,
and I think the crawl, walk, run approach is really applicable here. Like, just do a couple, that way if you start to get wonky, you're going to know real quick.
Absolutely, it's very much best practices to do a couple first. So I'm obviously going against the grain here, and then we're gonna actually go through and configure the IP address that we're gonna send this to. So the nice thing about ERSPAN versus other spans is that essentially you are just sending this traffic to an IP address. So on a lot of other spans that you might be aware or used to using, you're actually sending it to a port on a physical switch, or you're sending it to, just where you want to, what VLAN that you want to send it to, or a port that you want to send it to. With ERSPAN, you're actually sending it to an IP address, which makes it really kind of nice for, it's very easy and very flexible that way.
So that's the IP of the RevealX sensor that we set up that you showed in that configuration doc, that you could set up one of the ports to be an ERSPAN target. That's that IP.
Yep, absolutely.
Address.
And just like it says in our docs, you can set up the regular management port for ERSPAN target or any of the other interfaces you can do. So whichever you want to do there. So, and that's the basic walkthrough of setup. Again, we have a couple caveats there, but that's going to take care of it for you.
Sweet, that's awesome. And then kind of rounding out, any final comments? Kind of, you talked a little bit about it as we walked through it, and I appreciate that. Any other troubleshooting things? So it was really the VM kernel ports, making sure you're not mirroring the firewall or the RevealX sensor itself. Any other, as you walk through this, any troubleshooting tips that you would give in closing, Mike?
Those are the big ones that I've come away with. I guess I don't have anything else off the top of my head for
and then
you.
the end-to-end, make sure your end-to-end is covered as well, like that and then crawl, and before you start to run on this, add a couple sensors in production or a couple hosts before you start to add an entire subnet, right? So that you can wash that bandwidth, hit the RevealX sensor, and make sure that things are running correctly before you send gigs and gigs of traffic across an ERSPAN target.
Yep, absolutely. And if you do choose to select GRE as your mechanism instead of ERSPAN 2, what you're going to see in your sensor is just a whole pile of GRE traffic. So that's, I guess, one troubleshooting thing is you're going to see a bunch of GRE traffic. You have to go into the admin console and turn on the encapsulation for NVGRE.
And that's if you don't do type 2, if you've done GRE for whatever reason, you just need to make sure that it's okay. That makes sense. Cool.
Yep, exactly.
This is super helpful. East-west traffic in general, and ERSPAN is a little bit of a dark art, and so I appreciate you taking the time to unmystery this for me and the people watching, because it's nice to see the screenshots and know how you could start to do this in your own environment. So I appreciate it, Mike.
No problem, Josh.